to Andrea.
Thank you. So good morning, Monday morning. So one thing you'd like to talk about on a Monday morning is funding. So let me just share my slides. I hope that worked because I just did it. Let me know. It's taking a long time.
Yeah,
Can everyone
we've
see
got
that?
them. Yeah.
Got it. Excellent. Can you see my notes page? Because if you can, that's really embarrassing. No? Excellent. Great. So let me just give people keep arriving, so I don't know if I should just wait a minute or just kick off. It's popping up on my screen. So anyway, I'll keep going. So this research project was actually commissioned to City Ready at the University of Birmingham. Anne Green and the team led on this work for Youth Futures Foundation, and the project is related to our Connected Futures Fund. So that was us funding local partnerships in certain areas around the country that were usually assessed on socioeconomic need, the problem they were trying to investigate and solve, and whether or not we thought some work could actually be done in that area over a limited period of time and with the money we were going to give them. It was also related to whether or not they built significant partnerships, because as we find here, what we're going to find here is directly related to the longevity of the project, because it's related to the funding, the long-term funding of the project as well, once we leave the picture. So areas that were funded included Hull, Brent, Lewisham, Burnley, Blackpool, D2N2, in only certain areas near Derby and Nottingham. And I always forget one. I think I did Burnley. I think I did them all actually. And then we also added Tottenham to that list. And this project was largely done during phase 1 of the project, and some of them now moved on to Hastings. Thank you, Hastings. And we've now started to move on to phase 1.5 or phase 2, where in the first phase they were investigating the problem, trying to understand what the actual problem is with young people getting into good jobs or getting into work in their local area. And now they're starting to investigate interventions that they could trial in their area, things that they could do in the area to make sure young people get into good work. Some of it's related to demand side problems where employers are not connected very well to the supplier, the young people in their area. And some of it had to do with their young people simply not having the skills or qualifications to get work in their area. So Tottenham, for example, are really interested as to careers education in their schools. So they have a large number of young people who go through full-time education, leave with degrees and simply cannot find work. Whereas Blackpool is looking at a large number of NEETs, a large number of young people who are off work, and they're trying to figure out how they can get them into good work. But this project, as well as the other learning lot, which is called local labor markets data, are the projects I led. And this one was specifically trying to understand the challenges around funding in a local area and how that might impact the outcomes you find in an area. And if we could we put together a typology of funding models? So certain areas of the country have certain types of funding in those areas. So the questions, research questions, I'm just going to show this because the research questions was 2 pages for this project. And that's sources of funding, who are the organizations involved, what are the aims and priorities of the types of the funding applications that these areas are more likely to make? Are there any economic incentives? Who is involved in the decision making? Are young people involved in the decision making about where the funding is going? Is there an evaluation of the funding itself or of the project that's been funded? How likely are there going to be evaluations of that? And if there are they done to top evidentiary levels, so that we can actually see if there's a way to trial something like that in other areas of the country? I'm just going to be joined by my cat, Bella. She is a keen researcher. She always joins me. And also, what are the future prospects for funding, given there's been significant changes over the last few years when it comes to funding in some of these areas? There was 2 phases of the project, but I'm just going to give an example of what I mean by funding. So that could be supporting young people out of work into work, like the Youth Employment Initiative, Careers and Enterprise Community Kickstart, or it can be, just as an example, education, but especially youth education. So skills. So, let me mute you because I can hear a lot. skills support for the unemployed, education and skills funding agency, apprenticeship levy, etc. And these aren't the only types of funding that they looked at, but this is just to give an example of what the project was looking at overall. So the approach, very quick approach for the first phase, and that was just to collect data. So they were really interested in data on the funder and the commissioner, because as we know, they are not always the same. The scale of funding, the type of contract that was involved, any type of delivery partner type, the program or an initiative focus, target groups, etc. So this humongous data sheet in Excel that was filling out all this information about every bit of funding that they could find. And some of it was heavily, so some areas, which we'll find later in the case studies, had funding that was by a local, a charity themselves was funding a project for another charity. So that would have made the list, but it also, the big programs from DWP would have also made the list. So there was the first big finding from this work for phase one was the significant levels of data gaps when it comes to understanding what types of funding is available in your local area. So there were funds where there was data showing the regional breakdown of recent funding flows, like the adult education budget, but there were funds where they were only found very limited or no regional breakdown of the funding data, like the National Citizen Service, Kickstart, digital skills boot camps, etc. They also had examples where funds where they only found a regional breakdown of funding for certain years, which is very frustrating. Only certain years provided that, which doesn't give you the ability to compare years of the funding that's going to that area. They also had data, but they had example of funds where they couldn't find any financial data related to the project, but they had data related to the number of starts. They had examples of funds where they conducted further data analysis to estimate the value of funding for young people. But then also they had loads of funds that were just simply not focused on young people's employment and skills. So they actually didn't do any further analysis on them. And that included the Towns Fund and also Leveling Up, because it did not specifically look at young people themselves. So one of more findings for this, and again, one of the major findings across the entire project is that the vast number of funding pots available in the country related to young people and not related to young people. The policy has sought to respond to a significant forecasted rise in youth employment, and that was supposed to be related to COVID. We're still seeing that there's been a rise in inactivity among some young people. There's been a rise in NEETs over the last few quarters and over the last year. And policy and the funding has sought to respond to that and cut that off before it could get even higher. There are also multiple funding areas that are related to young people and then also not related to young people. But again, yeah, you could apply for if you wanted to do it on young people. And that was youth education, general education, employment and health, general-based funds, general youth-related schemes like social impact bonds, criminal justice, so supporting, is there an echo? No? Okay.
I can't hear it, so I'm not sure if it's a problem for other people, but hopefully just push on, I think, Andrea.
Right. Criminal justice, so supporting mentoring, extra school tuition to catch up young people who have been through the criminal justice system to get them back on track, and also in prevention so that these young people could be targeted before they might commit a crime or do something that would land them in prison in the first place. And then housing, poverty, and social inclusion, so troubled families, staying put, etc. And the funds are designed to respond to specific needs of young people. So there's some funds that are related just to a certain thing. And the list was too long to put everything here, but again, a really good example is National Career Service or Youth Employment Initiative. And other bits of finding as they were looking at the scale and the large volumes of funding over recent years, such as 5.7 billion by DFE and the Skills Funding Agency related to continued learning after GCSEs, BTECs, etc. 4 billion on the Leveling Up Fund, 3.6 billion in the total awarded for Towns deals, which they didn't go into great detail other than figuring out just how much were related to these two funding pots, even though they weren't directly on young people, because again, the data did not allow them to see what was directly related on young people. So they were just able to see how much in total was allocated towards these two pots. 1.9 billion for Kickstart, 615 million pounds for adult education budget, which again can include young people in our target age group, which is between 14 and 24. And then 490 million was awarded by the DWP and ESF for the Youth Employment Initiative, and that's European Social Fund. Just going to go on to the next bit of phase one findings, and that is what funding models are most common in funding local areas for employment and skills. And so there's allocated funding according to socioeconomic need. There's a combination of allocated and competitive funding. And again, there's competitive funding, which is becoming increasingly more popular among some of these funds, is the idea of competitive funding. And then there's contracted funding, where the provision is commissioned by one organization and contracted to external suppliers. So for example, work and health program delivered by 5 providers across 6 contract package areas. And so in phase 2, the research team established an advisory board made up of representatives from central government, regional government, academia, etc., with whom they discussed the scope, content, and findings. So the issues that were emphasized amongst the advisory board was on the temporal priorities. So looking forward and looking backwards, the complexity and interlinkages between the funding streams. So I think for me, I was not really involved in looking at the funding landscape for the youth system or anything related to young people, and I was blown away just how complex the funding landscape was. The funding responsibilities and geographical scales was an issue, age cutoffs and funding and transitioning. So as soon as that young person transitions to a different age group, their funding landscape of what could be funding towards them changes completely. Looking beyond education, skills, and employment. And again, still remembering the demand side when it comes to getting young people into work. Funding to colleges and training providers, and then devolution and capacity and governance. And I think I go into a little bit more detail about that. So again, the funding landscape is highly complex. The key funders are the central government and the European Union. The key themes are employment, especially youth employment and education. The funding models are extremely complex, and also often the funding is short-term and it's challenging to gain a clear and precise picture of funding flows across at a local level simply because of the data gaps involved. So they were looking at, for example, the Princess Trust does not provide the necessary breakdowns to include some of the Princess Trust funding into this work. So all of that was left out because they do not publish some of that. And so that it did mean that we still do not have a complete picture of all of the funding that is available when it comes to young person, because some of the more local areas and some of the more local focused organizations do not actually publish any of their data on funding. And there was going to be a funding gap with the end of ESIF funding at the end of last year. And that is something that comes up in the qualitative interviews and the case studies, which is next. So they did qualitative interviews in a few of the Connected Futures areas, such as Blackpool, D2N2, Hull, Hastings, and Brent. They have actually completed them for all of them except for Tottenham. They're doing Tottenham right now. And the interviews were with funders, delivery organizations, and commissioners. And again, an overlap of issues that came up when actually talking to people on a local level. And there was the delegation or devolution of funding, the timescales involved with different funding sources. There's a mismatch between funding sources available and local needs. That was emphasized often for some of the areas. There was an overemphasis on outcomes, so they didn't think that they could actually do things related to what they needed to do, but related to the outcomes that were promised to attain the funding. The future funding opportunities, again, that was brought up a lot, especially in areas like Blackpool, Hastings, and Hull. There was a significant concern about the withdrawal of ESF funding, and because it's limiting holistic programs, and several organizations have withdrawn from this space already. And then there's also highly transient populations, which is a problem for engagement and monitoring. And there's also hidden populations. So we do know that young people do not always live in the same place for months and months at a time. They can move around quite easily. They might be sleeping on their friend's sofa. They might be doing something else. And it can be really difficult to target them if you don't actually know where they are and what their needs are. In relation to the 5th point, the funds presented in the report and the difficulties encountered identifying the data was indicative of severe challenges for funding of youth employment and skills initiatives in England. First, again, because the funding is short-term in nature, because there's an increased emphasis on competitive funding, it means there's significant problems with this type of model, and this is becoming more. There's been more and more of highly competitive but short-term funding pots available for people to draw upon. And then you get into an issue about the overemphasis of outcomes, and then also dealing with who your target population is if they move around a lot. And I love a graph. So this is just trying to understand, for example, Hull, where does the money go? Who are the providers? And this is just looking at a snapshot of providers, but it was true for all of the different areas. So it included the adult education budget. So a huge chunk of that money goes to Hull College. The 16 to 18 apprenticeships, oh, I can't read that very easily. The one at the bottom, it goes all across all areas of the providers. And for the partnership in Hull, they actually did not have any engagement yet with Hull College. And then they realized that the majority of the funding that they were looking at goes to Hull College. And so they were trying to understand, do we have the right partners in the room? So the right partners in the room so we can actually tackle this. And part of that, again, is understanding where the money goes. And if they're already not in contact with where the money goes, that shows a severe gap for them when they're trying to do partnership work. And then if you compare that with London, so this is just a snapshot of the money again. And again, you see significant numbers of providers in London for the same pots of money. Where when we discussed this with Brent, for example, they said, of course, it makes sense. We never feel like we know where the money is going. And the young people themselves said they do not feel like they have any stake in where the money is going and whether or not they can have any influence over what is funded and what is done in their area, because it goes to so many different providers, because London is huge. You know, it's a huge city. And then Blackpool. It looks like the Blackpool in, I never say this right, the college, Blackpool and Fylde College receives a huge chunk of the money, and the rest of it goes to the borough council. And that was across all of the different areas of funding available for Blackpool. And so there are severe policy implications. So there's the need for greater long-term funding. The interviewees argued that moving to a 5 to 10-year award would reduce competition and facilitate collective working. And it was also related to the idea in finding value in funding consortia bids in infrastructure organizations, because that is more long-term than a 1 or a 2-year funding model. They need a framework for understanding a young person's journey through participating skills, projects, programs, and employment. There's so many different projects available for them to get involved in, for them to be targeted for, and we need to understand what their journey is through some of those programs. Due to limited capacity to expand careers provision within schools, there should be greater funding for whole school approaches to developing employability skills. Funders need to better support long-term systems change by incentivizing and requiring local collaboration. I think it's again related to facilitating collective working and finding the value in consortia bids. Because again, there was just significant overlap in what some of these local partners were doing in their area, but there was no incentive for them to work together because of the funding model that was available. And then the scale of challenges in multiple areas requires organizations to collaborate. Again, the idea of collaboration, but the existing funding model does not allow them, or again, incentivize them to collaborate. And I've sped through this and I'm done. There's so much still in the report. It's going through external review right now, so it's being sent off to a few other academics to make sure we didn't miss anything and we're not totally wacko. And then we get to present it and publish it externally, hopefully at the end of next month. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrea. And hopefully you'd be happy to take a few questions at the end. So I'm sure people in the room will probably have some. So if you want to put questions either in the chat or put your hand up and I can bring you in. Maybe you've done such a good job, Andrea, that there are no questions.
I was just going to say, no. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, and then we'll bring Deborah in.
I was just going to say that there's a new phase for this work. Is because we are, again, keep this to yourselves. We're about to announce 2 more funding areas, one near Leeds and one near in Walsall, in the Midlands. And we're specifically looking at the intersection of ethnicity and race when it comes to funding, and whether or not there's some levels of discrimination when you have certain types of areas trying to receive funding under some of these banners, and they are systemically being denied access to them. And it could be related to Islamophobia or racism simply in the system. And that's something we're trying to push forward next, because the discussions we've had with those partnerships is that the level of attention either the government or some of their corporate backers give to their books, to their overall governance, is something well and above they have ever experienced, or any of the other partnerships in the area have ever experienced. And the only difference is these are largely Muslim, Bangladeshi, Pakistani areas that are trying to get funding. And they also have to deal with the interaction with the Home Office because of the prevent strategy when it comes to terrorism. So that's something completely different than we have seen in any of the areas that we've looked at. So again, we've looked at Brent, Lewisham, Hastings, Hull, Blackpool, Burnley, and D2N2. And again, that's an interaction that we've not had to deal with before. So I'm really looking forward to that next phase, because I think it gets into this idea that some groups are being systemically denied access to funding. Even if they overcome the other challenges in the funding space, they're being systemically denied access to that funding for their areas. And these are some of the highest need areas in the country. So essentially watch this space. I'm really excited.
That sounds very exciting indeed. Deborah, do you want to come in with a question?
There we go. Sorry, I couldn't get the mouse to move on the table. A few things I want to just raise. I've been in this game a very long while, so it means I've seen an awful lot of these things come round full circle. There's quite a few things you mentioned, but there's quite a few that you haven't mentioned. I work in Hampshire, supposedly a very affluent county, but let's just say some of our areas of social deprivation rival some of the worst in London. We've got poverty of place, family. So when they get to 16, they are so far behind where they need to be. I'm not sure how any programme with short-term funding is meant to address 11 years of failure. So I'm just going to throw that one in. The next one is parental pressure. We are seeing increasing parental pressure for their young people at 16 not to go to college, not to enter further education, to actually go out and find work and contribute to the household. And this is increasing week on week. You wouldn't expect it in some of these areas, but it's certainly happening, and it's a game changer, and that's the cost of living. So how you deal with that, I don't know, because no amount of programme funding is going to deal with that particular aspect. The other thing is FE. They are dropping courses that relate to the local labour markets. So there's no point running hair and beauty and barbering if we've got a queue of 2,500 youngsters actually qualified at level 2. Where they should be running courses, they're no longer doing it because they don't need to employ skilled individuals to actually deliver this. They can't get the staff on the salaries they're offering. So what we've got is a complete and utter mismatch. For example, I work in Basingstoke and Dean. You would imagine the local college could offer a level 2 bricklaying. They're not offering it. I've got students then have to travel a considerable amount of distances, and they don't, because they just don't have the money to actually access the courses for the apprentice support. So that is a real issue. And the other side of it is quality. I've got delivery in programs. What we're seeing coming out of those programs is actually, I don't know where the money's been spent, and I don't know who's monitoring the quality, but we're certainly not seeing it in the outcomes.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting, and I think it's a really good picture of some of the points that we did raise about, one, remembering the demand side when it comes to funding, that if the money is not matching what is going on in the local area. I am a Yank, so I actually have no idea about the difference in area when it comes to parts of the country. I did some work in poverty and local area poverty, so I do know about the distinct challenges when you're looking at some of the national data and the regional data, and it can hide pockets of poverty. And if the funding cannot respond to that, and I think that was something that came out quite keenly in some of these areas, that the funding cannot respond to that, that it takes it a very broad level and then assigns it based on that need, and then you miss bits of need across the country. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. Just all of your points were really interesting and really important to this work. But yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Also, as well as questions, we're very happy to take comments or, how does what Andrea has discussed relate to the area that you operate in, and how much does it match up with sort of your experience as a provider on the ground? Quite a quiet group today. Oh, here we go. Bella, please feel free to come in.
I'm gutted because I missed. I came in on the last slide, and so I'd love to see the slides if that's possible to be emailed out. That'd be great. But the last slide spoke to me a lot because I host a network in Hackney where I work, which is totally unfunded, but is a network of over 80 organisations. Intentionally, like the space was set up called 16+ Hackney to provide a space for anybody and everybody in the borough who is working with 16 to 25-year-olds to know about each other, so that, because what we saw was that professionals were not aware of each other's work, in which case they couldn't be referring young people between each other's services, and to be complementing each other's work rather than duplicating, and to create a sort of a system of better, complementary services rather than everybody doing the same thing and young people feeling like they didn't know anywhere where to go. So that whole, if we have tried many times to get funding to actually support, because of course I work for a very small voluntary sector organisation that is just large enough to support, to allow me to have the freedom to coordinate a network like this. And in fact, it was started by 2 voluntary sector organisations that are just big enough to host that. But actually, if we want to get any meaningful evidence of the work that we're doing, in order to include, the network has voluntary sector, statutory sector departments from the council and mental health departments. And so it was really about bringing together the different elements of the system as well, because what we saw was that voluntary sector was in one area and then statutory sector was in another area. Mental health was off in their own corner, but actually with 16 to 25-year-olds in this area, it's so important that everybody's complementing each other for those young people, because that's the stresses, particularly post-COVID, are so intertwined. But so if as I saw on your last 2 slides, that you are suggesting that be longer term funding for initiatives like this, which is about, and I always feel, so I suppose my question is, I feel like we're so far down the line now. We've been doing this for 3 years and it's working really well. And, we have subgroups and we've created different areas that have really had a meaningful influence in the borough. But we don't have much evidence of that work because you can't ask anybody to do anything. I mean, everybody's giving up their time all of the time to do this, and there's no funded way of collecting data to prove the stories or to prove the referrals and how the system has changed. Have you got any, do you think it's too late? Do we just carry on doing it for free like we've been doing, or is this that there is a tide turning that we could have more of a funded offer to support gathering that kind of evidence and working together?
Yeah, I will say it appeared in the evaluation side, actually appeared in the report as well. I didn't touch on it too much because it was extremely long about the challenge. And it was essentially what you've just been saying, that some of these things happen organically, they come together, and then they don't initially at the offset think, should we monitor this to see whether or not this will work going forward? It's usually just, there's a need, they're plugging the need, and then it continues, and then they realize, oh, we should be collecting data on this. And it can't, again, the funding models that exist, the type of funding that exists does not always lend to that time you need to set up this type of a system around a program so that you can collect the necessary data to see if it's working long term. So whether or not there's a renewed interest from funders, and U Futures is a funder, we always put in time for monitoring and evaluation. And we do a lot of evaluations ourselves. We run loads of evaluations as an organization. So that's always something that we're interested in. And I think something we have found as part of this process is that we're not alone in that, but there are some providers that simply do not provide the time for organizations to monitor what they're actually doing. And whether or not there's a tide turning, I actually simply do not know. I'd be really interested to know if anyone else on the call has any sight of that, where they've been dealing with funders that have been really interested in then taking the time to set up data collection so that they can actually monitor these things going forward and to turn them into a long-term plan or do things about cost benefit analysis, cost effectiveness and stuff like that going forward, and other evaluation tools for them to look at getting larger funding pots. That is ingrained in the Connected Futures Fund, something they had to set up early on. We have a new one called Building Futures that is also ingrained in the Building Futures Fund. And that's just been announced as well. So I'd be really interested to know if anyone on the call knows that. I would hope, as a data person, I would be really hopeful that there's a new eye on monitoring and evaluation of even the smallest of data pots, and then also turning that into better evidence for either the current government or whatever the future government looks like, because their priorities may change about how they fund, and they might be really interested in a story where you're able to say, here's a consortia or a collection of organizations doing long-term work, here's the impact, and this is something you should fund going forward. And I think that could be quite powerful for them, depending on who it is, of course.
And it's the evaluation from within as well. It's like,
Yes.
I need to fund the people within the network to gather, to be funded to gather the data that we want them to bring, and then we need the external evaluation of that as well.
Yeah.
And because, yeah, as you say, we just like, oh, there's a need, let's just do it. So
yeah. No, thank you.
I think it must also tie in with longer term funding, because if you're doing all this data and evaluation, if like with UK SPF, where we don't even know what's going to happen after 2025 and basically programs have only just started, then the evaluation piece fits in with that. Adrian, you've got your hand up, so if you want to come in.
Thank you, Jack. Yeah, my point was basically around what I've seen as a systemic issue between apprenticeships and traineeships. To me, traineeships are vastly undervalued in the whole ecosystem, and trainee and apprenticeships perhaps an element the other way. So what you'll find is that employers, particularly if they've got levy pots to spend, will happily sit with apprenticeship vacancies for months at a time, just dismissing candidates that are coming through to them, because those candidates, perhaps at that stage of their in their lives, are probably more suited to a traineeship. But the employer's not going to consider a traineeship because the provider that's been supporting them on the apprenticeship side doesn't deliver a traineeship. So there's a complete disconnect between what's actually required within the system. Even the few providers that deliver both traineeships and apprenticeships don't do it very well in terms of having a coordinated approach. I'm sure there's probably outliers that perhaps do it well, but the vast majority of the system just isn't connected in the way that it needs to be. So you end up with a situation where you've got employers leaving vacancies for months on end, and you've got candidates that aren't able to progress because they can't find the correct entry point. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also something we've heard from young people themselves when it comes to not even just funding, but they don't know where to go for what they need. And when they go somewhere for what they need, it's not the thing that they're doing. And I think that's directly related to funding, essentially what you've been saying. We saw that in Brent a lot, where they said, we go to this provider and we ask for this, and then we realize they don't do that. And they point us to another one, or they can signpost us to another one. But then they're not doing that anymore because their funding stopped. So, and there's no understanding of what the actual local system is like for a young person, of where they can access things. Can they access it in the school? Do they have to go to their college? If they aren't in college, if say they've already left for work, where can they actually access some of this stuff in the first place? And that's something we've heard a lot across the country for young people themselves. And that's why they said there's this huge disconnect between the funding of the programs and the projects and them, because it doesn't pertain to what they're trying to do anyway. So yeah.
And then the other one that links to that as well is the around the allocation of apprenticeship funding as well. So I think it alludes back to somebody was saying before about the lack of bricklaying. We saw that up in West Yorkshire as well, where Leeds College of Building basically cornered the market, and all they concentrated on was filling their cohort allocations, which, to be fair to them, they did very, very well. But then once they'd filled their allocations, anyone else after that was just swimming around trying to find training that just didn't exist. So there was gaps within the marketplace there, and I'm sure that's probably replicated, particularly in areas. I noticed that that must be prevalent in Blackpool as well. When you look at the level of funding and where the funding goes, that if anything that needs to be delivered by that provider isn't provided, then there's going to be a gap, and there won't be anybody else to come in and step in and fulfill the need.
Yeah,
I did see from on Kickstart and speaking and working with the employers we were working with at the time, there was a few that came to the realization that they needed to maybe relax their entry requirements for things like apprenticeships, because what they saw with young people coming in on the Kickstart programs is some really motivated, really enthusiastic, great young people who on paper didn't really have anything to say for themselves and just needed an opportunity. And I think that's partly where some of this disconnect lies, and that then links to my point around traineeships and how much more valuable traineeships could be in the system, but it needs to be linked much more closely to the apprenticeship activity to make it work. In the way that it's funded at the moment, it just doesn't.
Do you think that's also slightly related to the demand side issue that that was highlighted earlier? And also the fact that it just simply does not match local needs.
Yeah,
and local needs is just the local young people themselves.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I agree with Lisa's point. She's just put there about the lack of level 1 training as well. We saw that on the Need to Eat program I was working on. Big disconnect. And I think going back to your point before, where you've got because everything is done on that local authority basis, you'll have boroughs that present as being fairly affluent, but they've all got pockets of deprivation within them, and they're the ones that get missed. The local authorities where, broadly speaking, you've got much higher levels of deprivation, they're the ones that tend to get the attention. But the ones where you've got pockets within affluent areas, they're the ones that tend to get missed.
Yeah, I say that I live in York, so I think I understand.
York's a great example for that. There's a lot of affluence, but there's pockets of deprivation as well. And so if you looked at York in comparison to Leeds, Leeds will get the lion's share of the support and the funding for areas of deprivation, because it's much easier for them to demonstrate that there's more of it. And again, that comes back to a systemic issue in the way that the funding is allocated on a local authority basis.
I think it's an interesting point about Kickstart, because we've got some work, pardon me, going on about Kickstart. And one of the things that comes out of that is that because employers were given this money to hire someone to do a job that they needed to do, it automatically matches the need in the local area, because you're essentially saying do whatever you want with this money to the employer, but take a young person on and we'll provide the support in tandem with that, which only really works in a COVID context, because the employers were in as bad a place as sort of the needs that were being targeted at that time. And it's interesting to see if there's any way you could kind of continue that model of funding outside of the context of COVID, but I'm not too sure.
Effectively took the risk away for the employer, because they didn't have to fund the wages, so they could take risks on young people who under sort of normal circumstances they wouldn't give a second glance to for apprenticeships. But as I say, they realised, not in every case, but they realised in many cases that perhaps they needed to reevaluate their sort of entry requirements. Although I wouldn't mind betting that now that that's disappeared and the risk level is higher again, that those entry standards will be back to where they were before. It's a shame, but.
Right, any more comments, questions, reflections?
Sorry, I'm reading Deborah's comment. Is the issue of the question that needs to be asked is if what is offered locally regarding training courses that you should not be able to replicate provision of all your local neighbors' FE offering if you can demonstrate a local labor market for the provision. Can you expand on that? Sorry, I'm not understanding.
Hello, yeah, I'm sorry, I probably worded it badly. So one of the issues we've got is let's take an example I can actually give you. So in the middle of Basingstoke, 2 institutions offering practically the same things. Never used to, but do now for obvious reasons, because they're quick fixes for young people. And again, what's a quick fix is not necessarily the best fix. So, we know that short-term pain can lead to long-term gain. or you can, you know, quite happily brush them off and say they've got an outcome. So we shouldn't be allowing colleges to all offer hair and beauty or travel and tourism. Come on, you know, in the middle of a town that struggles for a tourist outcome, you know, why offer? Well, they offer it because it's cheap and easy to deliver, and actually they're going to get the funding that relates to bums on seats, you know, participation and outcomes. So as a business, they're just looking at what is successful for them. How are they going to get their money? They're not going to offer anything that they should be offering because it's going to be challenging and difficult to deliver. It's not going to be an easy fix for a young person. So why are we allowing FE colleges to all offer exactly the same courses? And I once had a conversation with a local authority and they were saying, oh, look at the outcomes for our NEETs. They were talking about those that were 14 years of age in alternative provision. And I said, no, they've chosen that because it's the only thing they know at 16. You've put them all at 14 in these courses. They've simply chosen courses that they've already got experience of because they've had tasters for 2 years. That isn't necessarily what they need or what they would choose. It's all that they know. And again, why do we allow FE colleges to offer the same when actually what we need is a completely different offering to relate to local labour markets?
So I don't want to like put you on the spot. I'm really interested in this because it's how would you organize that? So how do you change the system in a way? How do you make it so that, you know, further education, so the colleges themselves do not, I see it as an economist, I see it as almost like colluding, so that they don't do that anymore because of the type of funding that's available. How do you change that? What comes first? Is it the funding that changes first?
I think it is. I think
more
it's
related,
the area.
and then it's the providers that have to change because the funding has changed, or is it the providers change and then they require a change in the funding? So how do you do that?
I think it would be a change in the national picture, which is the way we fund has to change. I mean, we're quite happy to throw billions at, you know, alternative providers and DWP programs, and yet for FE colleges have got a begging bowl out for their provision. So I think what we need to do is look at the much bigger picture, because you're right, populations move, young people move for work. So what are we saying? That, you know, we're going to stop that. We're going to stop that social mobility. We're going to stop that ability to, you know, actually thrive in our workplaces. So I think there does need to be a thinking needs to be taken away locally, because actually locally we'll always be looking at what's good for them as an institution, whereas we keep talking about national pictures here, and it is a national picture. We need to change, we need to pull it away. The other thing is I'd be looking at quality, which is if the outcomes for those youngsters when they went through these programs, then pull the program from the college, you know, make them realise that actually there has to be some kind of outcome, some kind of improvement, some kind of benefit for a young person, so that they do thrive when they leave school, college, what comes next.
Adrian.
It was mainly just to really agree with what Deborah was saying there. I think the challenge that the FE colleges have is because the nature of how those institutions sort of operate and are funded means that it's very difficult for them to move out of anything that's generic. So difficult for them to meet and respond to need particularly quickly, because it's difficult for them to be agile, again, because of the basis of the way that those institutions are operated and run. I mean, of course, you've got alongside that then a lot of the independent training provider marketplace, who in essence should be able to fulfill that gap. But of course, that's done very much on a sort of patchwork basis, and it very much depends on which of those providers wins in which area, the funding that's required. And yeah, I think a lot of it comes back to the way that the funding is allocated, really. And you've got just a bit of a disconnect between the ITPs and the FE colleges based on the way that they operate. Makes it really difficult for them to be agile enough to meet that labour market demand as it moves.
Brilliant. So sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but Corinda Malley, you've got your hand up if you want to.
Yeah. So I think it's time how New York is provided with disabled people, because I'm disabled myself, and if someone was able to work, like for employment, for them, I think it's time to say, oh, it's not an injury, blah, 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 and all that. I think it's like time to say, okay, this is that for the disabled people.
Yeah, I think the thing with this forum is it's obviously us as a I'm not sure if you know us as a membership body of employment support providers. So this is very much a forum which is targeted to people who are helping participants who need help finding work rather than helping participants find work through this forum, if that makes any sense. I know I don't know if you've come across it on Eventbrite, and perhaps that's kind of where a bit of confusion lies.
Yeah.
Just quickly, Elizabeth, us as CEO, has made a good point about the Kickstart conversation we were having a couple of minutes ago. In that, although that happened during the pandemic, historically there were other programs which work with both employers and young people, like wage subsidy programs. Sort of, so yeah, kind of against my point of it's not just COVID; it has existed sort of outside of that. Got any more comments coming through or queries? Yeah, Darius.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Andrea. Really interesting. And what I guess what I'm wondering about is, are you hopeful? Because what you described is pretty complex, maybe a bit downbeat. There's kind of there's like intention to support, all this funding going in, but we don't really know where it's going, if it's even working. I don't know if that's an unfair kind of headline. I'd love to hear, like, what is there anything giving you hope from what you've seen, or you go like, yeah, well, look, this, we need to do more of this, or yeah, I'd love to get a sense of that, if there is that.
Yeah, I think again, before Connected Futures and before I joined U Futures at the end of 2021, I had been working for Joseph Rowntree Foundation, so big, well-funded organization. So I never had to think about funding at all. I had never worked for a grants program, and I think sorry, she's back. She wants treats. Whenever I talk, she wants treats. So otherwise she'll be loud until I give her treats. But I gave her treats too much. And so now I have to get rid of that response. So now I have to just deal with her loudness. Yeah, so I think just someone who's really new to the space, the one thing I'm not like grateful for, but something that I really love to see is how those who we fund respond to our model, because our model is usually very different to how they've operated. We do not put any emphasis on outcomes in the first phase at all. We have very little emphasis on the outcomes themselves. We collect the data for them. We provide the outline for what data they should be collecting on a local level. We help them through that journey. We see it as almost like building capacity within the space, providing additional knowledge for how you can set up a program so that you can get really good funding, have the time to research what you're trying to do, and then also collect the data and monitor it. And then we will pay for someone to evaluate it for you. We will deal with the data issues of getting a sample to compare it to. We will deal with all of that. You can just focus on running a program. And I think we've had a lot of conversations with DCMS about our funding model, who fund us. So our funding comes from DCMS, and they particularly like this model. And I'm hopeful it means, and it's going through the DWP about how we're doing this as well, and even DFE. And as we saw, they allocate a lot of funding. And I think they can recognize they create the conditions for this because of what they're doing. So hopefully I am hopeful that this is kind of reaching the tentacles of those who are responsible for the system so they can create better conditions. We have presented this work to DFE and DWP multiple times. We've had multiple conversations with our stakeholders in those departments about essentially cleaning up the funding system and making it more systemic and more useful for people who are trying to access it, and also, again, put young people at the heart of what they're doing. So I am hopeful in that they have been really interested in this, and interested to see how they could take that message back to how they allocate funding themselves. But whether or not that is at the scale that is needed, not even just because it doesn't just come from DWP and DFE, it comes from local pots where the data does not exist. The data does not exist, and we cannot find that data because they don't collect that data. They don't publish that data. They don't have the breakdowns on that. I think that is the bit that I'm really nervous about, because I think that is an entirely It's related to an overall data system across the country where data that is needed to understand what's going on in the public is not always available to the public. That is information that you would want to know if you're in this space and you simply can't find it. That is a part of a wider systemic issue on data that people at my job have heard me rant about for over 2 years now. So I think for me, I'm really hopeful in that the providers of some of the funders are listening to a new way of doing things. I also get really hopeful in how who we fund and those who are funded respond to that. They're really welcome. They welcome it and they see it as a breath of fresh air. But again, they always tell us it's the first time we've ever dealt with anything like this, and that they almost don't know how to respond to it sometimes. And they think it's a trick. And I think that shows for me the depths of the problem with the system, is that people think a good thing is a trick, not necessarily a good thing when it comes to the funding system itself. So, and again, I've been saying this like every day since January 1st, there is a general election coming up. We don't know what the future holders of DFE, DWP, DCMS, etc. are going to do when it comes to funding. We don't know what it will look like. And you can only be hopeful that they actually want to do something positive when it comes to funding. Something I asked the City Ready team is, was the incomplete or the huge systemic challenges with funding, was this new, or has this been happening for 20, 30 years or 10 years or whatever? When did it start? Because then you can try to tackle why it started that way. And they couldn't tell you because there was no data to tell you that. So you could argue that it's been like this for a very long time. I'd be interested to hear if people think there was a structural break or something changed when now the funding landscape is something completely different, because then it could also point to why it's different, if that makes sense. So yeah, I don't know. I'm hopeful, but then also not hopeful.
I have a bit of a question around the point of the general election this year. Would you say, and what would be your answer? Do you think when we had European money in the system as well as UK government money, was that money more consistent because it wasn't in the hands of ever-changing governments or factions within governments, as we've sort of seen in UK politics in like the last 5-10 years?
Oh, no. Oh, geez. Okay. I guess I can say this. As a former academic who had access to EU funding for even research in academia and at universities, I think there's a point to say that EU funding was more structured. It was more long-term. You could receive money more long-term, but access to that money was still highly competitive and highly regimented. They were still interested in outcomes. They were still interested in some of the issues that are related to the system now. Whether or not it fostered better organization of funding in areas, I am not sure. I'd be really interested to hear from anyone saying like that received most of this money or a lot of the money, like Hull, Blackpool, etc., to see whether or not they think Bradford, if they actually think this related to outcomes, to better outcomes because of the way the EU money was structured. I do not think the amount of chop and change we've had in the political system here in the UK has helped the funding system here in the UK. I think that's a pretty easy connection to make, that the changing prime ministers, the changing ministers, the changing priorities, the differences between what's the towns fund going to do and leveling up, the changing idea of what leveling up is, new combined authorities, new mayorships. I think that has made a system where people almost don't know what's going on. And then they can't find the data on where the funding is and what they can do with it as well. So I do think there was that connection, but I'm not sure the EU was the shining example of a really good system. I think they had good examples, but also possibly bad examples. But then I've not been in the space for a very long time, but that's just what I could see on the report that they'd written up for us as well. They did 3 reports for us, and that's what I could see. So that EU funding was good, but it could have been better. The system it is now is really awful, and it should be better. So.
And I think even like with the chop and change, even people in skills, UK SPF funding going to DLUC instead of DWP has always been something that I think didn't make much sense. And on the minister's point, it's like ERSA's CEO will soon be meeting with her 10th employment minister since she started the job in 2019. So like that's a lot of chop and change really.
Yeah.
So last chance for any questions, and then if not, we'll sort of finish on the hour. The recording for people who missed the beginning of Andrea's presentation will be sent out to those who registered, and hopefully also your slides, if that's okay, Andrea. Yep. Fantastic. No, but I think it's been a really good discussion at the end of this. It's always good to sort of relate what's going on in the research and policy world to what people are experiencing on the ground. So thanks a lot, Andrea, for being with us today. We'll be back next month. I think next month we're going to be talking about early interventions, sort of for younger than the age group we typically talk about at ERSA, and how that can make a difference. Elizabeth, do you want to add something? See if you come on with your camera. No?
I know. I always unnerve everybody when I do that. I just wanted to do a shout out for the manifesto and the membership brochure that we've just launched in the last 2 weeks. We'll drop them into the chat. If you're not an ERSA member, please consider joining us. But also, please look at the manifesto that we've produced with 5 asks for the future of employment support. And I think it really crosses over nicely with the agenda about youth employment. So I'll leave it. I'll turn my camera off, Jack.
No, brilliant. And actually, on the topic of shouting out things that are going on, that reminds me, there's an inquiry happening in the Work and Pension Select Committee about the evolution of employment support. We've got a survey out to inform our response to that. We're going to do one on behalf of the ERSA membership. I will, in the follow-up email, I will link the manifesto, the membership brochure, and this survey, because it's obviously the wider sort of participation we get in that over the next 2 weeks, the better of a response we can write, sort of on behalf of the sector. But anyway, thanks a lot, everyone, for attending today, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you. Thank you.